Have you ever wondered how the state of Israel came to be and who or what influenced it to become the independent state that it is today?
Do you think the Holocaust and Israel are interconnected?
Using Edith Zertal's book, Israel's Holocaust and the Politics of Nationhood, we will discuss the way the Holocaust shaped the formation of the State of Israel. During the formation of the State of Israel, the Holocaust was used as a tactic to reaffirm Zionist movements within Israel. Zertal argues that there is an undeniable connection between the State of Israel and the Holocaust. Throughout history, the Jewish people were consistently viewed as victims. Following the Holocaust, they were forced to change the narrative from victimization to resistance in order to fight for and claim the State of Israel that is today. Israel's nation was formed as a sabra, hard on the outside and soft on the inside, because they no longer wanted to be seen as victims. They wanted to die and fight for their country, and this is what essentially changed the discourse of the Holocaust.
Here is some background information. Idith Zertal was a cultural and political journalist and essayist in Israel. She taught history and cultural studies at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya and at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has also been a visiting professor and senior research fellow in the United States, Europe, and Israel. Her book, Israel's Holocaust and the Politics of Nationhood, centers around the construction, representation, and signification of the Holocaust in Jewish Palestine up to 1948 and in the State of Israel. Prior to World War II, a Zionist movement within Israel was already forming. The Battle of Tel Hai was the very first military engagement between Zionists and the Arabs, where the defeats of the Zionists were transmuted into tales of victory. This battle had a significant influence on Israeli culture as it inspired a heroic story and influenced the military for decades after. Yosef Trumpeldor was considered the hero of the Battle of Tel Hai. He was an early Zionist activist who began laying the foundations of Zionism before the battle. A new generation, a generation of free Jews of Eretz Israel, stand at the frontier prepared to sacrifice their lives for this frontier. He died defending the settlement of Tel Hai in 1920. His last words before his death were, "It's nothing, it's good to die for our country." These words transformed into the symbol and slogan of a critical period in the history of Zionism. Trumpeldor's words became a symbol of Jewish self-defense, and the graves of others killed in the Battle of Tel Hai became the model for future cemeteries and memorial sites of those who had died defending their homeland. Tel Hai was an ever-visible presence for every man and woman in Palestine, with the belief that it is good to die for one's country. David Ben-Gurion was the primary national founder of the State of Israel, and during this time he was a major Zionist leader. Even years after, the Battle of Tel Hai was not forgotten. Gurion made a binding connection between Tel Hai and the Warsaw Ghetto, and between combatant Zionism in Palestine and the Jewish uprising in Poland. Following the end of the war, the Jewish people had nowhere else to settle in Europe as their homes were destroyed or taken over by the Nazis. Many of them fled to Israel in search of starting a new life. The Holocaust reaffirmed the Zionist ideologies that existed long before the war. These ideas include that life in the diaspora was too dangerous for the Jewish people, and that nothing can protect the Jews as individuals other than their own Jewish state. A Jewish state that includes its own military and political power would offer a future to the Jewish people.
Because of the horrors from their past, many survivors became defined by the fact that they survived. Consumed by the guilt of other family members or other Jews dying in the Holocaust, but the fact that they survived resulted in a mutinous and lifelong self-imposed guilt. The inability to talk about the Holocaust was supposed to be breached by the State of Israel, which was one of its roles assigned and the justification for its establishment, to give the survivors a voice. Israel's legislature and courts during the first decade of statehood were also the main stage on which society confronted the moments of the Holocaust. Through these institutions and other discourse, the Israeli political and cultural establishment gave a new meaning separate from how Israel was defined in the past. David Ben-Gurion, who became the executive head of the World Zionist Organization in 1946, was trying to erase not only the century before Israel's establishment, but the entire period of the Jewish diaspora. Law 1950, the Punishment Law, was passed to provide the Jewish state with the means to bring justice to those who were involved with the Holocaust. This law was enforced to have a legal code against the Nazis and Nazi crimes, even if it was only symbolic. It was a law for the survivors. However, the Justice Ministry officials were having trouble distinguishing the difference between Nazis and collaborators. Nazis were murderers in the camp, whereas Jewish capos were forced to act as they did. So does that make them on the same level? This continuous debate proved the complexities that the law faced. Could a Jewish prisoner refuse a task and stay alive? Do you think it was right of them to comply and kill other Jews, or should they have sacrificed their own death? Unfortunately, if one Jew did not comply, they would kill them and move on to the next, just resurfacing the inevitable death of them all. The law was intended for Israel to become a pure state of Jewish shame, to clear the air among survivor immigrants, punish criminals, and exonerate the innocent. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were over 40 trials held under that law. Jewish citizens, new immigrants, Holocaust survivors, and anyone who was seen as a Nazi collaborator. Except no one of the law was charged with or found guilty of directly or indirectly causing the death of a single person. This law was used to show Israel's new narrative of the Holocaust, that they were taking control on the people who essentially victimized them during the war. The law affected any individual who participated in war crimes, which refers to the murder of a civilian population of an occupied country or within an occupied country, their oppression and deportation for forced labor or any other purpose, or crimes against humanity, an action that could be deemed inhuman. Adolf Eichmann was a Nazi officer who played a central role in the logistic system of German dictatorship and the main transporter of European Jewry to the death camps to be persecuted. The punishment law fitted Eichmann's actions and crimes, which is why it became one of the most famous trials in history. The law should have been called the punishment law of minor collaborators of the Nazis. However, the legal process did not make the essential distinction between Nazi criminals and Nazi victims defined as collaborators, many of whom did not survive the Holocaust. After the war, 300,000 survivors immigrated to Israel and changed Israeli society. Even though so many of them were living there, people were celebrating the heroes involved in the Holocaust instead of commemorating the victims and the survivors. The Eichmann trial is one of the reasons Zertal claims that changed the narrative of the Holocaust and is the reason for the state of Israel today. During the trials, the Israeli government spent majority of the time on other Jewish collaborators because how could they build a nation with individuals who collaborated with the enemy? But the Eichmann trial was the first time the Holocaust was actually being looked at from a specific perspective, from a position of power, sovereignty, and control. Ben-Gurion wanted the people to know what happened during the Holocaust and that those will be punished for what they did. The Eichmann case, his capture, the preparations for the trial, and the trial itself was transformed in Israeli conversation into a symbol of Israel's asserted sovereignty and power. The tone was set. The Holocaust, along with its victim, was not to be remembered for itself, but rather as a metaphor or a lesson to teach Israeli youth and the world that Jewish blood would not be defenseless again. Do you think it was Israel's responsibility to hold those accountable for the Holocaust? Some people argued that Israel as a state had not existed when Eichmann's crimes were committed, and the fact that they were committed in Europe. Therefore, it was technically not for Israel to judge. The Eichmann trial didn't only reaffirm Israel's newfound strength, but it also led Gurion to the conclusion that Arabs and Nazis were one and the same. Time after time, Gurion used the Holocaust as an excuse for political debates. If others disagreed with him, he would use the Arabs turning on the state of Israel and potentially wiping out the Jews again as a tactic to get people on his side. He wanted to raise the state of Israel as fighters and not victims. This is why he began to develop a nuclear bomb in the 1950s, a weapon that was meant to be used against the Arabs. He was only able to do this once pleading for Israel's rights to develop its own security needs because of the Holocaust. Gurion essentially turned the Holocaust onto the situation in the Middle East, even though they were extremely different. Do you think all Arabs are Nazis? Or do you think all Nazis are Arabs? This is how they were compared. It was transplanting of one situation onto the other. There were massive references to the presence of Nazi scientists and advisors in Egypt and other Arab countries. There were ongoing connections between Arab and Nazi leaders. They had the same intentions as the Nazis and plans to annihilate Israel. Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, were connected with the Nazi regime and Eichmann, and they also were depicted as a designer of the final solution. After this comparison was made, the actions of Eichmann or other Nazi criminals were rarely mentioned without the addition of the Arab Nazi dimension, because most Nazis were said to have escaped to Arab countries. Mufti was the most extreme leader the Israeli Arabs have ever had. He was a main collaborator with Eichmann and urged the plan of exterminating Jews to solve the problems of Palestine. However, there was a lack of evidence. Was it right of Ben-Gurion to execute the war with the Arabs? If he hadn't, would the state of Israel be what it is today? Today, it is known as the Independence Day War, and this is why Ben-Gurion became the father of our nation, because it was a miracle that the Israelis won the war.
Hannah Arendt was a Jewish political theorist and is considered one of the most important political philosophers of the 20th century. Arendt covered and reported the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which evolved into creating her book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Her book provoked a lot of controversy among the Jewish community. Arendt was extremely critical of the way the trial was conducted in Israel and of the way some of the Jewish leaders acted during the Holocaust. She used the term the banality of evil to describe Eichmann. Although she loathed Eichmann and despised him from the depths of her being, she explains in her book that Eichmann was a law-abiding citizen who simply obeyed his orders. In Arendt's eyes, Eichmann was the exemplary product of a government which destroyed its own citizens' ability to distinguish between good and evil and right and wrong. She argued that there was nothing banal about the crimes perpetrated by the Nazis. The crimes were unheard of in their horror. She was the very first to grasp the radical evil and novelty of the totalitarian system whose aim was the destruction of the concept of humanity. It was banal in the sense of being common and normalized at the time. Arendt was critical of the prosecution's hopeless attempt to prove that Eichmann had murdered the Jews with his own hands. She didn't think this was the point. She thought efforts to prove Eichmann's monstrosity devalued the meaning and unique nature of Nazi crimes. She believed it was his normalcy which called for attention. She did acknowledge Israel's right to try Eichmann because so many survivors had immigrated to Israel and made it their home. She also supported the death sentence because of the totally non-banal crimes Eichmann committed. She felt that he did not deserve to live because he carried out a policy of mass murder, a refusal to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of other nations. She stated that no member of the human race can be expected to want to share the earth with him. Her arguments regarding the Jewish leaders were interpreted as lack of compassion around the question of whether the Jews could or should have defended themselves. She believed that the extensive cooperation of the Jews with the Nazis in all countries of Europe facilitated their murder and magnified their destruction. Most of the Jewish leaders during the Holocaust adopted the stereotypes of their persecutors about themselves and their community. She continues to explain that had the Jews not been organized throughout Europe, and had they been leaderless, the total number of victims of the Nazis would never have reached 6 million. She brings in evidence to show that wherever the Jews did not cooperate and instead fled the Nazis, the number of victims was halved. Her main question to the Jewish people is, why did you not rebel? What do you think of her idea that the Jews played a part in their own destruction? Do you think they had a choice or an opportunity to defend themselves and rebel against the Nazis?
In conclusion, the trials were the first years of statehood in which great efforts were being made to create a new national identity and change the narrative of the Holocaust. On May 1st, 1953, the Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Law was submitted. 10 years after the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the State of Israel was finally creating its official national memory of the Holocaust, the museum known in Israel today, Yad Vashem. Another law, the State of Education Law, was permitted so schools in Israel had to teach their children about the Holocaust and about resistance. Each law, in its own way, was used to show individuals from all over the world to remember the horrors of the Holocaust, but to also share a single vision of the present and the future. The goal was nation building and how the Holocaust shaped the nation that came to be. The Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Law was the connection between the Holocaust memory and the State of Israel. The Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem is significant that Israel is our country and Jerusalem is our city, so therefore it is the right place for us to remember the Holocaust survivors, as Jerusalem is the heart of Israel and the Holocaust is the heart of our nation, so everything should be concentrated here.
The Holocaust convinced the Jewish people that they were entitled to a state of their own. The Jews were seen as victims long before the Holocaust and long before the State of Israel was formed. Israel as a nation will forever be the result of and affected by the Holocaust. Here are some concluding words from Idith Zertal herself.
About the title, it's not easy because, the book was published in several languages, and almost each language or each publisher in the different languages followed, some ideas. The original title, I would say it in Hebrew if you wish, האומה והמוות, היסטוריה, זיכרון, פוליטיקה. Now, if I'm very sensitive with words, and האומה והמוות is very close phonetically, not content-wise, but phonetically to a quintet written by Schubert that I love very much, which is called Ha'alma ve'Hamavet, The Maiden and Death, by Schubert, which everybody knows. So it was also phonetically important to me, but it says everything that I wanted to say in the book. It means nation and death, or death and the nation, history, memory, politics. This is the original title. Now the book, the book was written in the years of the Second Intifada. And it was under the impression of the ongoing bloodshed, of the futility of this conflict, of the cruelty and futile perpetuation of this conflict, because of the perpetuation of what I call Israel's victimhood, is created and developed and articulated since the early years of statehood, and even before. The proximity of the two events. On the one hand, the Jewish catastrophe in World War II and the genocide that the Nazis have perpetrated against genocidal policy that the Nazis have Nazis have perpetrated against the Jewish people, European Jewry. And on the other, we had in a proximity that we couldn't really, as historians, ignore the establishment of the State of Israel. In my view, by the way, a direct outcome of this catastrophe in World War II. And the establishment of the State of Israel took place in 1948. So you couldn't really separate the two events, the two major events. And it became indeed in a process intertwined, completely, absolutely connected to each other, defining each other, explaining each other, nurturing each other, etc., in a reciprocal way.
Like heard in previous presentations, a lot of people believed that God was not present during the time of the Holocaust. But what if God was present in a way that many people did not understand? What if God's presence was there simply to create the state of Israel and the homeland for the Jewish people? Do you believe this was God's plan overall, that the state of Israel came from the Holocaust? Do you think if there wasn't a Holocaust, would the state of Israel exist for the Jewish people the way it is today?